comfort, and wellness. Imagine a place where you can rise to Cloud 9. Directly connected with Addis Ababa and the Bole Airport by high-speed rail, the new Bishoftu International Airport is a central node of a new regional transport system.
Prime Minister of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, Abiy Ahmed, has officially launched the groundbreaking of the Bishoftu International Airport city, marking the beginning of what will become Africa's largest airport and one of the world's most ambitious aviation and airport city developments. Valued at over $10 billion, the landmark project ranks among the largest infrastructure investments in Ethiopia's history and reflects the country's long-term national vision to position itself as a global...
So let me say a few words about Ethiopia and why I love this country and why I have so much confidence that this country will continue to inspire us. This country is where the seat of the African Union is. And it used to be many years ago, many years ago, that people used to actually literally complain that the city wasn't looking up to par with the fact that it was hosting an institution like that. But today, looking everywhere in this city, this is a city that Africa is very proud of. And I remember when I came with my friend, the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance, we went to many areas, they were all slums, and he told me, he said, well, Akin, by the time you're back, this will be done, that will be done. And every time that I come here, everything moves at incredible speed. I look at the work we've done together on agriculture. The African Development Bank provided Ethiopia with seeds for heat-tolerant wheat varieties that you planted in your lowlands. You started with 5,000 hectares of those. Just to give you a sense, because we are talking about airlines today, African Development Bank provided 65,000 metric tons, tons of seed, together with your research station. Now, your Airbus 380, it's about what, 98.4 or so tons. So you can just imagine the scale of amount of seeds that we're talking about here. You're probably talking about almost 665 Airbus 380 aircraft lying on a landing strip. That's the scale that we're talking about. Ethiopia moved from 5,000 hectares to 650,000 hectares. It went to 2.2 million hectares. Today, Ethiopia declared itself as self-sufficient in wheat in just 4 years. Think about that. Amazing. Congratulations. Before coming here today, I was taken in to go and do the lessons at the flight simulator. I flew all the way from Dubai to Dar es Salaam in Tanzania and Julius Nyerere Airport. I landed the aircraft very nicely. Everybody is safe. So please, as I retire, I will come back and join the Ethiopian Airlines as your honorary pilot. And those who want to fly that plane with me, buy your tickets now because they're on sale. What a great day is this. A great day to be with you. It's a family. It's a wonderful day. I will miss Ethiopia. My heart is always here. I will always have Ethiopia on my side. And my heart will always be there to do all I can to support and strengthen the development of this wonderful country. Thank you very much.
Ethiopia's decision to build a mega airport unlike anything Africa has seen before did not begin as a spectacle. It began quietly as a calculation. For decades, African economies had been designed to move outward, feeding distant markets while remaining dependent on foreign logistics, foreign financing, and foreign approval. Air transport, in particular, remained one of the most tightly controlled gateways. Whoever controlled the skies controlled trade, tourism, investment flows, and political leverage. Ethiopia understood this reality earlier than most. What emerged was not simply an airport, but a continental logistics engine. Designed to handle volumes comparable to the busiest global hubs, the project signaled a shift in how Africa intended to connect with the world. Instead of routing commerce through Europe or the Middle East, Ethiopia positioned itself as the primary air bridge, linking Africa directly to Asia, Latin America, and emerging markets. The scale was intentional. Runways capable of handling next-generation aircraft, cargo terminals built for industrial-level exports, and passenger capacity designed not for today's demand but for Africa's next half-century. This infrastructure did something quietly revolutionary. It collapsed distance. African producers who once needed multiple transfers through foreign hubs could now ship goods directly to global markets. High-value agricultural exports, pharmaceuticals, electronics assembly, and light manufacturing suddenly became viable at scale. The airport was not meant to serve tourists alone. It was built to serve factories, farms, and future cities that had not yet fully formed. As construction advanced, the surrounding region transformed, logistic sparks emerged, warehousing districts multiplied. Manufacturing zones aligned themselves along transport corridors radiating from the airport like spokes from a wheel. For the first time, an African nation was building aviation infrastructure not as a prestige project, but as the backbone of an economic system. Investors noticed, airlines adjusted routes, freight forwarders rewrote contracts. This is where concern began to ripple beyond Africa. For decades, the global aviation ecosystem funneled African traffic through established hubs outside the continent. These hubs earned fees, jobs, influence, and leverage. Ethiopia's mega airport disrupted that model. Cargo that once passed through foreign-controlled airspace now stayed on African soil longer, generating value locally. Decision-making power shifted closer to producers rather than intermediaries. The implications extended far beyond aviation. Financial flows followed logistics. Insurance, trade finance, and settlement systems clustered around the airport's operations. Local banks expanded capacity. Regional currencies gained relevance in cross-border transactions. Digital platforms integrated customs, shipping, and payments into unified systems. The airport became an anchor for a broader financial ecosystem that reduced dependency on external intermediaries. From a strategic perspective, this raised alarms. Airspace is not neutral. It shapes military mobility, intelligence reach, and diplomatic leverage. An Africa that controls its primary aviation arteries is harder to pressure, harder to isolate, and harder to coerce. The airport's design included resilience redundant systems, diversified energy sources, and regional integration that made it less vulnerable to external disruption. This was infrastructure built for autonomy. The ripple effects spread across the continent. Neighboring countries aligned their transport policies to connect with the hub. Rail links, highways, and regional airports were upgraded to feed into the system. Smaller economies that once depended on distant hubs now gained faster access to markets through Ethiopia. This strengthened regional trade in ways that trade agreements alone never could. Goods moved because pathways existed, not because paperwork promised future cooperation. Tourism shifted as well. Direct routes made African destinations more accessible without detours through foreign capitals. Conferences, exhibitions, and cultural exchanges increased. Soft power began to circulate within the continent instead of flowing outward first. African cities became meeting points for global business rather than peripheral stops. From the outside, this looked like infrastructure. From the inside, it felt like a rebalancing. The reaction abroad was subtle but unmistakable. Policy discussions began framing Africa's infrastructure push as a competitive challenge. Analysts questioned sustainability while quietly acknowledging effectiveness. Investment narratives shifted from partnership language to risk language. The concern was not the airport itself but what it represented, an Africa capable of designing systems that reduced reliance on external gatekeepers. The airport also changed how African labor was valued. Specialized training programs created a new class of aviation engineers, logistics analysts, data specialists, and operations managers. These skills were transferable, scalable, and exportable. Human capital development accelerated alongside concrete and steel. This mattered because economic independence is sustained by people, not projects. Environmental considerations were built into the design, countering old narratives that framed African development as inherently extractive or reckless. Energy-efficient systems, carbon mitigation strategies, and regional climate planning positioned the airport as a model rather than an exception. This undercut arguments often used to slow African infrastructure expansion through regulatory pressure. Trade patterns confirmed the shift. Agricultural exports moved faster. Manufacturing timelines shortened. Perishable goods reached distant markets intact. African firms negotiated contracts with more confidence because delivery risks declined. Reliability became a competitive advantage, something African exporters had historically been denied by weak logistics. The airport also altered political psychology. It demonstrated that scale was no longer exclusive to the developed world. African ambition was no longer confined to incremental progress when infrastructure is built. At scale, it reshapes expectations. Citizens begin to demand systems that match their potential. Governments recalibrate priorities. Regional cooperation becomes practical rather than rhetorical. For global powers accustomed to shaping African outcomes through access control, this was unsettling. Influence had long flowed through choke point sports, airspace, finance, and technology. Ethiopia's airport reduced one of those choke points, not eliminated but weakened, and weakened leverage is often more destabilizing than lost. Leverage because it introduces uncertainty. The economic consequences extended into manufacturing relocation. Companies seeking proximity to African markets found it easier to base operations near the hub rather than ship finished goods from abroad. This began a slow but measurable shift in value chains. Assembly moved closer to consumption. Job creation followed. What made the situation more significant was replication. Other African nations studied the model. Not all could build at the same scale, but many could integrate. A networked system emerged with Ethiopia's airport. As a central node rather than a solitary monument, this network effect multiplied impact far beyond national borders. The narrative of dependency began to erode. Africa was no longer merely receiving infrastructure. It was deploying it strategically. The airport symbolized this transition. It was not about competing with global hubs on prestige, but about redefining what African connectivity looked like on African terms. Economic data reflected the change. Export volumes increased, transit times decreased, investment confidence strengthened. The airport's influence showed up not just in aviation statistics but in GDP composition, employment patterns, and trade balances. These were structural changes, not short-term spikes. External reactions oscillated between engagement and caution. Partnerships were offered, but with conditions. Cooperation was proposed, but often framed to preserve old hierarchies. Ethiopia's response was measured. Engagement continued, but control remained local. This balance was crucial. Independence did not mean isolation. It meant negotiation from strength. Over time, the airport reshaped perceptions of Africa's future. Investors stopped asking whether Africa could handle scale and began asking how quickly it could expand. The question shifted from capability to trajectory. This is the point at which strategic anxiety intensifies because trajectories are harder to reverse than isolated projects. The broader implication is that infrastructure can be policy. Concrete can carry ideology. Runways can signal sovereignty. Ethiopia's mega airport did all three without confrontation, without rhetoric, and without spectacle. It simply functioned, and in doing so, it changed the rules. As Africa continues to urbanize and industrialize, the importance of such hubs will only grow. Trade will accelerate, mobility will increase, political alignments will evolve, and the old assumption that African growth must pass through external gateways will continue to weaken. The airport stands as evidence that economic independence is not declared. It is built, piece by piece, system by system, choice by choice. What alarms external observers is not a single runway or terminal, but the realization that Africa is learning to design its own future at scale and that this future does not require permission. In that sense, the airport is not just rewriting Ethiopia's economy. It is rewriting Africa's role in the global system, and once that process begins, it rarely moves backward. The deeper consequences of Ethiopia's mega airport only became visible after the initial excitement faded. When the cranes left and the terminals filled, the project stopped being a vision and started behaving like a system. Systems do not announce themselves loudly. They change outcomes quietly and repeatedly until the old patterns no longer work. One of the first changes appeared in how African trade negotiations evolved. For years, trade talks were constrained by logistics realities. African negotiators often accepted unfavorable terms because delivery timelines, insurance risks, and transport bottlenecks weakened their bargaining power. With a high-capacity aviation hub operating at continental scale, those constraints softened. Exporters could guarantee delivery windows. Governments could commit to supply volumes. Contracts once considered too ambitious suddenly became routine. Power in negotiations shifted not through speeches, but through reliability. This reliability altered investor psychology. Previously, capital flowing into Africa was heavily skewed toward extraction or short-term returns. The airport created conditions for long-term planning. Investors in manufacturing, pharmaceuticals, electronics, and agribusiness require certainty in movement of inputs and outputs. The new hub provided exactly that. As a result, investment began to favor productive sectors rather than purely speculative ones. This changed the quality of growth, not just its quantity. The airport also weakened a long-standing structural imbalance, the outward drain of value. Traditionally, African exports traveled outward quickly while profits accumulated elsewhere. By extending the value chain within the continent, Ethiopia retained more economic activity at home. Packaging, processing, logistics management, quality certification, and financial services clustered around the airport. Each layer added jobs, skills, and domestic revenue. The export was no longer just a raw product. It was a service-rich package. The transformation of labor markets followed. Young professionals trained not only in aviation but in data analysis, supply chain optimization, cybersecurity, and systems engineering. These skills were portable across industries. The airport became a talent magnet, drawing expertise from across the continent and reversing some aspects of brain drain. For the first time, highly skilled Africans moved within Africa for opportunity rather than leaving the continent entirely. This internal mobility strengthened regional integration more effectively than policy declarations ever had. Economic corridors formed naturally, driven by incentives rather than treaties. Neighboring states aligned customs procedures and digital platforms to access the hub's efficiency. Harmonization happened because fragmentation became costly. In this way, infrastructure achieved what decades of diplomatic language could not. As African trade intensified internally, external dependence weakened. This did not mean disengagement from global markets. It meant diversification. Africa could choose partners rather than rely on a narrow set of gateways. This flexibility altered geopolitical calculations. Influence became something to be earned through cooperation rather than enforced through bottlenecks. Security implications emerged as well. Control over major logistics infrastructure strengthens sovereignty. The ability to sustain supply chains during crises reduces vulnerability. Pressure. The airport's design emphasized redundancy and autonomy, ensuring operations could continue even during global disruptions. This resilience mattered in a world increasingly shaped by shocks, pandemics, conflicts, financial instability, and climate events. The ripple effects extended into diplomacy. Countries that once engaged Africa primarily through aid frameworks now encountered an Africa negotiating from a position of competence. Development discussions shifted toward partnership language grounded in mutual benefit rather than dependency. This recalibration unsettled institutions accustomed to setting the terms. Environmental narratives also shifted. Large infrastructure in Africa had often been criticized as environmentally risky by default. Ethiopia's approach challenged this assumption. Energy-efficient systems, regional planning, and long-term sustainability metrics demonstrated that scale and responsibility could coexist. This undermined arguments used to delay or restrict African projects under the banner of environmental concern. Trade data confirmed structural change. Export diversification increased. Time-sensitive goods gained market share. African airlines expanded routes previously dominated by non-African carriers. Freight capacity growth outpaced forecasts. Each metric reinforced the same conclusion. Africa was no longer waiting to be connected. It was building the connections itself. The broader continental impact became undeniable as other nations adapted. Some developed complementary hubs, others specialized in feeder systems. The result was not competition but coordination. A distributed network emerged, reducing over-reliance on any single node. This network resilience made Africa's logistics ecosystem harder to disrupt and easier to scale. External reactions grew more complex, engagement continued, but with increased scrutiny. Policy debates abroad began framing African infrastructure as a strategic variable rather than a development issue. This shift revealed an underlying truth. The concern was not about airports but about agency. An Africa that controls movement controls its destiny more effectively. The economic story also influenced culture. Mobility expanded, ideas circulated faster, collaboration across borders increased. African cities became hubs of innovation rather than endpoints of extraction. The psychological impact of this shift cannot be overstated. Confidence grew, expectations rose, and with rising expectations came demands for better governance, accountability, and performance. This feedback loop mattered. Infrastructure enabled growth, growth enabled confidence, and confidence enabled reform. The airport thus became part of a virtuous cycle rather than an isolated achievement. This cycle is what truly unsettles observers who view Africa through outdated frameworks. The airport also revealed a deeper lesson. Infrastructure is not neutral. It reflects values, priorities, and strategy. Ethiopia's choice to invest at scale signaled belief in Africa's future market size, talent pool, and relevance. It rejected the notion that African growth must be incremental and externally guided. Instead, it embraced the idea that Africa could design systems for its own realities. As global trade patterns evolve, the importance of proximity to emerging markets increases. Africa's population growth, urbanization, and consumption potential position it as a central player in the next phase of globalization. Logistics hubs like Ethiopia's airport accelerate this transition by making African markets accessible and efficient. The alarm this creates abroad is not rooted in hostility but in adjustment. Global systems built around predictable hierarchies must adapt to new centers of gravity. Adjustment is rarely comfortable. It introduces competition where comfort once existed. It challenges assumptions that guided decades of policy. For Africa, the lesson is clear. Strategic infrastructure multiplies options. It does not eliminate risk, but it shifts who manages that risk by owning the systems that move goods, people, and capital. Africa gains leverage without confrontation. Influence flows naturally to those who make things work. The long-term consequences will unfold over decades. As industries cluster, cities expand, and trade deepens, the airport's role will evolve. What will remain constant is its symbolism, a tangible expression of African ambition executed at scale. The story is not about one country alone. It is about a continent learning to align vision with execution. The airport is a chapter in a broader narrative of self-determination expressed through systems rather than slogans. In conclusion, Ethiopia's mega airport is not simply rewriting an economy. It is reshaping expectations. It demonstrates that Africa's future will not be defined by scarcity of ambition or capability, but by the choices it makes and the systems it builds. The discomfort this causes abroad reflects a changing world, not a threat. As Africa continues to invest in connectivity, production, and human capital, the question will no longer be whether it can compete, but how global systems will adapt to its presence. The runway has been laid, the direction is clear, and once momentum takes hold at this scale, it becomes very difficult to stop. What began as an infrastructure project has become a signal. Africa is no longer waiting at the gate, it is building the airport.